This session we're going to talk about fencing. And fencing or forms of animal exclusion are essential to truly moving toward extending the season to be able to farm year-round. If you look at history, it's really interesting to see the relationship that exists when animals and crops are separated. For example, in America, during the late 1800s, when there was the discovery of barbed wire in around the 1870s or so, it had a huge impact on the ability for the country to settle the vast territory to the west. And if you go further back in history, for example, in Ireland, you see these famous great stone walls all around the countryside. And if you go to England, it is really well known for these live living hedges. They call them hedgerows. And these were used to separate fields, and they were used also for excluding animals from getting in. There's definitely a limit to how productive land will be when animals are present, when animals actually rule the landscape. And we see clearly from the beginning, God gave the charge to mankind to steward his earth. He never gave that command to the cows or the goats or the sheep or the pigs. And when animals rule the landscape, it's contrary to God's order. And in my experience, where you see the animals present, where farm sizes are already very small, people are almost always dealing with scarcity. I have found very few exceptions to this. When animals are present and are free to roam, the rainy season production is the sole means, or nearly the sole means, for producing the year's food supply. And we've already talked about how important it is, how the tropics actually yield less per cropping cycle because of the shorter day lengths and some other factors, and how production dramatically increases when you're able to stretch that out to capture that available sunlight that is there 12 months of the year that doesn't exist in other parts of the globe. This is the quality that is so special about the tropics, and it needs to be represented in our farming systems. The plants that are present, capturing this valuable sunlight. But when the goat's present, it's hard because they are hungry and they need food, and they don't necessarily know how to steward the earth. And so they can have that in their grazing for food, they can really reduce productivity and uninspire people to plant orchards or to plant a coppicing woodlot. So in my experience, where animals and crops are not clearly separated, there is usually issues of food shortages. In Ethiopia, I had asked the missionary, what happens in this field right here? We were standing in a field, and I asked him, what happens here when this teff, it's a kind of a grain, is harvested? He said, if it's harvested in the morning, his neighbor's cows will be there in the afternoon. And it's so common that this kind of scenario. These animals come in and they're looking for food, and they rob God's blanket, the covering that is there for future fertility. And it keeps any further farming activities from happening the rest of that season. It also rewards those few people in the villages that have the bigger animals or the more animals. Meanwhile, those with fewer animals or no animals have their crop residues eaten up. There is again no motivation to plant something else in that field, knowing that at the end of the rains, people become more relaxed about the control of where animals roam. I want to take a look at some examples from fencing in other countries, and hopefully you will see how critical these fences are for allowing farmers the freedom to grow food all year long. In this first photo, I was here in Zambia, and it took us about 5 minutes to enter this garden. And the garden was enclosed by a fence that had been of accumulated thorn branches. and he's opening the gate, so to speak, to get us into the garden. You can see now in this photo the garden itself. And this is the first time they were ever able to garden during the dry season. They had never had a vegetable field before. They were only able to do this because they had a fence. There were cows right nearby, but they were not allowed to come in because they were excluded. There's some very effective forms of fencing. You can see one example in this picture of using sisal. This plant is a valuable plant for making rope. And so not only is it excluding animals, but it's providing additional income opportunities in a very useful product in making rope. And here you see a very crude example of a fence now. This is just cut branches that are very, very thorny and laid on top of each other, but is effective in keeping the animals out. In Haiti, they use a type of euphorbia. It's kind of like a cactus, and it's a very effective way of building a fence, but it does not exclude animals. Animals still can penetrate through, but this is an example where it's incorporated now with trees, and it makes an impenetrable hedge, and it's fantastic, as now the trees are providing another valuable resource for the farm family. They might be harvesting it for wood or using the leaves for forage. If animals are a huge problem in your area and you're wanting to build a fence, you may have to choose species that the animals don't browse, such as that euphorbia that I showed you in picture a little bit ago, or perhaps a senna tree or a eucalyptus, or observe in your own area where you might find an ungrazed species that would make a good fence species. Here in Haiti, you see another example of just a tight hedge of just multiple trees, and a valuable nursery is in the distance. You can't see it. It's because it's so protected, and this fence is so thick. It's keeping animals out, and there's a valuable resource of a nursery full of trees behind it. Cactus can also be used for making a fence. And now in this next picture, you see dead posts, wood posts that were a living tree at one time, now being replaced with actually live trees here in Nicaragua. They're actually replacing out these posts that are dead, and actually then getting in another resource from their fence. And one of the big things is it's excluding the animals, but now they're actually getting forage. As you can see in this last picture, they're able to harvest now the fence line. And if you harvest it frequently, you're going to get forage. And if you have a longer pruning cut, 6 to 8 months, you're going to favor wood production. And so fencing is an incredible asset to farmers in that it's so significant in increasing the options that people can do by excluding animals. History tells us this, and if we learn from history, we'll see that civilizations prosper and are able to grow and produce more food when animals and people are separated but still related. If you want to know more about species that are suitable for live fencing, you can contact ECHO, where we both have a document on the topic of species that make great choices, as well as seeds available that you can get in free trial packets. In the next session, we will be talking about animal production, which is an incredibly relevant topic now that we've discussed excluding them from farmers' fields, no longer eating God's blanket, no longer eating those crop residues. So we do need to provide other options for animals, and we can actually intensify, we can actually increase animal production by doing planted perennial forages. So we'll be talking about that in the next session. Thank you very much for your attention.